All right, welcome back. Chapter 23, Part B. So this is Part B, or second part out of 3 videos. So video 1 was a little long. I apologize for that. Part B and Part C are both going to be much shorter than Part A. So when we left off, I was talking a little bit about how biodiversity has increased throughout evolutionary time. We've seen a general increase in the number of species and the number of families represented in the fossil record. And really quickly, I wanted to mention 2 vocab words that the book uses to talk about examples of fairly rapid speciation. The first is adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is when you get a fairly rapid speciation event that produces a cluster of closely related species that occupy different habitats or consume different foods. And the best example for this is the Galapagos finches, which I know we talk about like every lecture. I'm sorry, but it's just a good example. And it begins with the Galapagos Islands, which don't really have any finches on them, and then an ancestral species of finch lands on the islands and spreads out throughout them. And due to the different habitats and the different foods that are available, it undergoes an adaptive radiation. So fairly fast speciation that leads to all these different species of finch over the next, I don't know, X number of years. So this can happen, the adaptive radiation can happen when new habitats become available or when new foods become available. You can, as another example, you can think of like when new islands appear, right? That's a new habitat, or when new foods appear. So maybe as plants move onto land, that can lead to an adaptive radiation of land animals that are able to move onto land and consume the plants. Another term that we use is adaptive zone. The book doesn't have a good definition of this, but an adaptive zone is basically a triggering of rapid speciation due to animals evolving to take advantage of a new habitat or food source. So it's kind of like an adaptive radiation, but here we're focused more on the zone or the environment rather than the speciation. And if that didn't make sense, let me just try to explain it through this picture on the left. So imagine we've got some algae, and some of these algae live in marine environments, so we can see some speciation going on among the marine algae. These are green algae. And then some of these are able to move into fresh water, and we see some speciation going on. And then we see some that are able to move to a new adaptive zone, and this is the semi-aquatic zone. So these are able to live maybe on the edge of a river or the edge of a lake or pond. And then some of these green algae were able to move onto the land entirely, so they were able to break into this adaptive zone. So you can see that there's 4 adaptive zones represented in the picture. There's the marine, the freshwater, the semi-aquatic, and then the terrestrial environment. So the algae progress from the marine and freshwater to the semi-aquatic to the land. And so these are examples of fairly rapid speciation following the colonization of a new adaptive zone. Okay, so at the end of last video, again, I talked a little bit about biodiversity increasing, and I talked about mass extinction events. So let's revisit that idea. So again, biodiversity tends to increase, and speciation is happening at different rates throughout different environments and different phases of evolutionary time. But extinction is also happening. And extinction is simply the death of the last individual in a species. Or extinction can be defined as the death of the last species in a lineage. Okay, so the dinosaurs went extinct. So that entire lineage ended when all the dinosaurs died, except for the one lineage that survived, which gave rise to modern birds. So extinction is normal. So in other words, extinction is going to happen. So the reason for this is the environment is always changing. New species are appearing. Competition is changing, continents are shifting, the global climate shifts, rainfall shifts, new diseases arise, whatever. And so extinction is normal. And therefore, there's a background extinction rate. The background extinction rate is simply the rate at which species go extinct as environments change and poorly adapted organisms fail to survive or reproduce. So the vast majority of species that have ever lived are extinct, all right, although some of their lineages live on. And the background extinction rate, again, this is just happening, this is just normal, and it happens in the background. And the book quotes one scientist who says that on average, as many as 10% of species go extinct every million years, and maybe as many as 50% go extinct every 100 million years. So that means about every several hundred million years, we've almost got 100% turnover in that most species end up going extinct and new ones arise to take their place. Throughout Earth's history, there have been several mass extinctions. So a mass extinction is simply when large numbers of species and lineages die out over a relatively short period of geological time. So a mass extinction can happen in a series of years or centuries or even millennia, but those are all short time frames on a geological scale. Throughout Earth's history, there's been several mass extinctions, and the number differs depending on who you talk to. Usually people say there's been about 5 historical mass extinctions, and we're undergoing the 6th mass extinction currently due to human influence. In this graphic, you can see that, just to get you oriented, this y-axis is the percentage of marine genera, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So this is at the genus level. And the spikes here are showing the percentage of marine genera that go extinct. So they disappear from the fossil record. So these red dots signal mass extinctions that have been marked. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So this lists 6. I said 5. I told you people don't agree. Now, we don't know the reasons for all of these mass extinctions or these smaller extinction events. You can see all these various peaks through here. So the peaks that have the pictures on them, these 3, scientists have pretty good idea. They're in pretty good agreement over the causes of these 3 extinctions. This one occurred at the end of the Ordovician period, about 444 million years ago. And it was due to a drop in global temperatures, or at least a drop in temperatures on land, or a drop in temperatures on the main continent that was in the southern hemisphere at that time, which is called Gondwana. So this continent moved south due to continental drift, and as it moved south, it got closer to the South Pole, and this triggered glaciation. So a lot of the water ended up getting locked up on the land as ice sheets and glaciers, and that reduced sea levels, and that's why a lot of these marine critters died here at the end of the Ordovician. This mass extinction event happened at the end of the Permian. This is the end of the Paleozoic era, which we'll talk about later. And this is thought to be due to widespread volcanic eruptions. And so these eruptions were from these huge volcanoes in Siberia that spewed out lava. And today, you can still find these rocks. They cover about 1.6 million square kilometers in Northeast Asia. And this volcanic activity released a bunch of sulfur dioxide and changed the pH of rainwater to a really acidic level. And so that affected the pH balance in the oceans, and that's thought to be the cause of the Permian mass extinction. And then the mass extinction event that ends the Mesozoic, which happened at the end of the Cretaceous right here, we've already talked about, and that's probably due to the asteroid that struck near Chicxulub, Mexico, off the Yucatan Peninsula, and caused climate change, and there may have also been volcanic activity that was involved. I didn't talk about this graphic, so I'll mention it really quickly. This is tracking trilobites. So trilobites are an extinct type of arthropod. It's a marine, kind of like a flat little critter that lives on the bottom of the ocean. And you can see that its biodiversity increased, so it shows up in the Cambrian. It increased and was in pretty good diversity, had pretty good diversity numbers at the end of the Cambrian and beginning of the Ordovician. And then it slowly, ever so slowly, became less diverse until at the end of the Permian, there were only two families that were still represented. And then what killed them off was this right here. The Permian extinction killed off and was the mass extinction event that put the finishing touch on trilobites. So I just wanted to show this to give an example of a species that grew in biodiversity in early Earth history, and then slowly experienced extinctions, and then a mass extinction finished it off. So mass extinctions cause a loss of biodiversity, but in the long run, it leads to an increase in biodiversity. And the reason for that is when a lot of species die, it opens up habitats and open up new adaptive zones for new species to take their place. So in this slide, you can see right here on this line is the end of the Cretaceous. This is the asteroid impact. So this is that big mass extinction event that I keep talking about. And so that caused a loss of diversity in some plants, including, you can see the conifers. The number of conifer species declined after that. The number of ginkgos declined after that. The number of ferns declined after that. But the mass extinction event opened up new spaces for the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, to radiate, to speciate. And so you can see angiosperm biodiversity increases after that time. We see the same thing with mammals. So when this same mass extinction event killed off the dinosaurs are gone. The dinosaurs ruled the land at the time. And this allowed the mammals to undergo a pretty extensive adaptive radiation and take the niches in the ecosystems that the dinosaurs left empty. And we'll talk more about that in the next video. The evolution of some species can drive coevolution with other new species. So an example of this is the flowering plants and insects. So here you can see, like I just talked about, the angiosperms saw a lot of speciation and increase in biodiversity after the KT extinction. And so with more and more flowering plants evolving, this allowed more plants. It provided a greater diversity of flowers and fruits, and basically more food and habitat for pollinators and insects that eat plants. So we see that the increase in the angiosperm biodiversity is parallel to the increase in insect biodiversity during this time. This is from your book. This is just another representation of a history of animal diversity. So in this top graphic, you can see the trilobites. This is actually some of the same data I showed you a minute ago. So trilobites, increase in biodiversity, and then a slow decline, and then the Permian extinction wipes them out. This is the number of families represented by mollusks. So you can see a similar tale. So they increase a little bit later in the Paleozoic. They decline a little bit, and then the Permian extinction really puts a hurting on them. They bounce back a little bit, and then we get another drop at the KT extinction, asteroid impact, and then their numbers have remained more or less constant ever since. For these different species that are represented here, this is a combination of mollusks and echinoderms, arthropods, and fish, and you can see that the number of families represented in these animal groups has more or less steadily increased through time. They take dips at the mass extinction events that I keep mentioning, but they bounce back, and overall their biodiversity has been increasing. So the history of life on Earth is a changing landscape where different animal and plant species dominate at different times in Earth's history. Let's talk about some mammal evolution, and I'm actually going to skip this slide. Let's talk about horses. So in other words, I'm going to talk a little bit about macroevolution, and again in the third PowerPoint or third video, I'm going to talk about macroevolution feathered dinosaurs and whales primarily. But let's briefly talk about some other mammals. So first up is horses. So the oldest horse fossils are from these little horses that were around about, I don't know, 55 million years ago, 40 million years ago. And they were really small, so they're dog-sized. And they didn't have hooves. They walked around on feet that had four little toes, cute little toes. And these guys were real small, and their teeth suggest that they primarily were browsers, not grazers. They were browsers, and they ate like leaves and stems and stuff like that. What we see in subsequent horse fossils is that over time the horses got larger. So here's a modern horse. You can see it's really big, right? So it's, 5 feet at the shoulder, perhaps. And so they've been getting bigger through their evolutionary history. And then their legs have changed pretty significantly, especially their feet. And so this species, Mesohippus, instead of walking around on 4 toes, it walked on 3. This guy, well, he's not shown here, great. Parahippus is another one. And so it was walking on its middle toe, and the toes on either side were kind of off the ground, like kind of hanging. And then later horses, they're walking on 1 toe, and the toenail kind of started to become a hoof. And in the modern horse, that's what's going on. This is a modern horse leg, and it's walking on its middle finger, basically. And its hoof is basically its middle claw or fingernail. And these side toes have basically become really small bones on either side of its leg. The teeth of horses also changed. Here's another picture of the same thing. This is a repeat of what you saw on the last slide. This shows their teeth, and you're not a horse dentist, if such a thing exists, and I'm not either. So we have to trust the paleobiologists here. But these early horses ate. Why does my cursor keep disappearing? These early horses, like I mentioned, ate grazers, and were grazers. Daggone it, they weren't grazers. Let me start over. The early horses were browsers and ate twigs and leaves. We can tell that by their teeth. But as we track the teeth through these subsequent horse species that are represented in the fossil record, their teeth begin to take a shape that's more consistent with animals that eat grass. So this all makes sense because when they're small and they're walking around on their the 3 or 4 toes, depending which leg we're talking about, they're probably living in the forests. And as the climate and the environment change, and by the way, this is happening in North America, but over time the forests started to disappear due to climate change. Grasses evolved, so grasses show up for the first time. So there weren't really many grasses when dinosaurs were around. And so this new food source, grass, is really beneficial. And so some of these horses start eating grass. Grass grows in the open plains. And in the open plains, you're not going to be able to hide from your predators. You're better off if you can run from them. And so it's thought that this evolution of the leg, going from several toes to ultimately 1 toe, kind of was good for running. It allowed them to run faster and to escape predators. Same thing with being larger. Being larger let them run faster and let them fight off predators a little bit better, and so on. So all of these things are clues. All of these different aspects of horse evolution are clues that help us try to recreate their evolutionary history. Sometimes we see the evolution of the horses, or evolution of anything, displayed like this, like in a line, so very linearly. So it might give the impression that this horse evolved into this one, and this one into this one, and this one into this one, and this one into this one, and so on, but that's not really true, right? So here we can see that now this is a little bit different. This is showing body mass on the y-axis, and the x-axis is time that's spanning the evolution of these horses starting around 50 million years ago. And you can see these horses that generally they got larger, but some got larger and then they got smaller. Some got larger and then they got smaller. Some got larger and then flattened out. And modern horses are the biggest of this lineage. So modern horses are descended from a lineage of ancient horses that over time got bigger and bigger. All right, so that kind of goes in line with this display. But if we go to this chart, this is showing the family tree of horses. So up here is modern horses and their relatives. So the genus is Equus. So this would include donkeys and zebras and horses. And if you trace their evolutionary history, this green line shows kind of the main trunk of the tree, and that parallels pretty nicely with this representation. However, if you look, you'll see that there's lots of side branches. So the evolutionary tree of horses splits into all these different side branches, and um, and so therefore it's kind of misleading to present the evolution of the horse like this. It's much better to represent it as a branching tree. Notice also that the bulk of the horse's cousins and ancestors have gone extinct. So everything has gone extinct. These are all only known from fossils, except for the living descendants of these horses. So again, donkeys and horses and zebras. Let's talk elephant evolution. So elephants, and you're going to see that a lot of mammals display the same general pattern of the horses, basically growing larger and diversifying into lots of different lineages. And then the modern representatives are like the sole survivors of this vast evolutionary history. So there are two species of elephants on Earth today, the African elephant and the Indian elephant. And from the fossil record, we can see that there have been lots of different elephant species through time. The oldest ones start off really small. All right, so this is actually this one here. So you can see they're relatively small. They're not the huge beasts that we know them to be now. And the early elephants didn't have much of a trunk, right? So they didn't have the big ears and the huge tusks and the long trunks that modern elephants do. However, as they diversified into lots of different species, and the trunks got longer. This one's kind of got a medium trunk. This one's got a longer trunk and large tusks. This one has a lower jaw that's scooped, and they would probably dig up roots or tubers or whatever, dig up the mud and eat plants in the mud. And then we've got this lineage that gets larger and larger and gives rise to mastodons and mammoths, and modern elephants are the cousins of those. So the evolutionary history of the elephant spans about 35 million years, and it follows a similar pattern to the horses. Camels also follow a similar pattern. So going back about 65 million years, so this is right after the dinosaurs go extinct. In North America, we find these guys. So camels, the ancestors of camels that are like small, they're walking around on multiple toes. 10 million years later, they're more deer-like. All right, but they're still, this is really fuzzy, but they're walking around they've got 4 toes and they're walking on 2. 20 million years later, they're a little bit bigger. Their necks have gotten a little bit longer, and they're walking around on 2 toes. And then skipping ahead to the present, the modern camel, they have 1 hump or 2 humps, and also they spin off to be alpacas and llamas. But the modern camel has a long evolutionary history where they got larger over time, and their teeth changed as they adapted to different food sources, and they went from walking on multiple toes to, in the case of the camel, just walking around on 2 toes. So that raises the question, what's the tempo of phenotypic change? In other words, how quickly do species evolve? Right? And what's the pattern of evolution as species evolve? Well, we're not really sure, and it differs from species to species, but there's 2 kind of competing ideas. The first is the phyletic gradualism hypothesis. And the phyletic gradualism hypothesis basically says that most morphological change occurs gradually over long periods of time. So you can see that in the picture on the left. This is just something I pulled off Google. So here's the ancestral butterfly, and you can see that it splits into 2 lineages, and these 2 lineages change in their own ways, but it's fairly gradual and predictable and steady. And so some species, like the horse, is probably a pretty good, you could argue that the horse evolution is I mean, there's a lot of branching that goes on, but it's fairly gradual and steady. Punctuated equilibrium hypothesis says that speciation usually occurs in isolated populations and that it happens in spurts. So just to represent it in the model, here's our ancestral species, and then boom, we've got a new species, and it might remain relatively unchanged for a long period of time. And then boom, we get a speciation event that creates this species, and then it remains relatively unchanged for a long period of time. So the punctuated equilibrium hypothesis doesn't fit the horse model very well, but you could argue that it fits the finch model pretty well. So finches underwent that adaptive radiation we keep talking about, and so the event that caused rapid speciation was arrival at new uninhabited islands. And so these two hypotheses are kind of, you got to hold one in one hand and the other in the other hand. They both explain patterns that we see in the fossil record, but you have to be flexible. Sometimes the phyletic gradualism hypothesis explains the data better. Sometimes the punctuated equilibrium model explains the data better, especially after mass extinction events. We see like pretty rapid speciation happening, and sometimes it's a hybrid of the two views. So it's just two models that help us explain and talk about the tempo of evolution over time. Another thing that can happen is there can be differential growth of body parts and changing of developmental events in the course of the evolution of a species. So on this slide, we'll talk about two examples. One is allometric growth. Allometric growth is the differential growth of body parts. In humans, for example, we have allometric growth in the sense that when we're first born, we're nothing but skull. We're just a huge head with a freakishly small little body hanging off of it. So look at a newborn baby, and that thing is basically all skull. Right? The body is poorly developed, the limbs are poorly developed, it's just like a skull with a digestive system attached to it. And as we grow, the head gets a little bit bigger, but the body really is where most of the changes take place. So in humans, we have allometric growth, and the body changes at a faster rate than the head or the skull. Another example is in chimpanzees and humans. So you can see that over here. So in a chimpanzee, this is what a baby chimpanzee looks like. So it's got a really kind of a flat face and a small jaw. But by the time it's an adult, that skull has grown in a way where the jaw has grown a lot and the face kind of starts to extend, so the front of the face is angled. What's interesting is in humans retain the infant form. In other words, we start off flat-faced, and then as we get, excuse me, and then as we get older, the skull gets larger, but the face more or less remains flat. So this is just two differences. In chimps, the face becomes angled. In humans, it remains more or less flat. And so this isn't due to like new genes. This is just due to the way that the genes influence development and growth. So heterochrony is changes in the timing of developmental events. And I'll go to this next slide. An example of a change in the timing of developmental events is paedomorphosis. And in paedomorphosis, paedo means child, morphos means form or shape, so child shape. So paedomorphosis is the development of reproductive capabilities in an organism with juvenile characteristics. So a good example of that is these small-mouthed salamanders. So salamanders are amphibians, and if you remember from frogs, you'll remember how frogs start off as little tadpoles with gills and a tail. So it's similar to salamanders. So typically they start with gills, and then once they reach the adult stage, they have lungs. Well, in the small-mouthed salamander, the adults retain those juvenile forms, so they display paedomorphosis. In other words, this adult has gills, right? And so what happened here is there was a mutation that basically allowed them to maintain sexual maturity while retaining the juvenile form. So this is an example of how a new species can form just due to the changes in their developmental patterns. All right, and there's an example from flowers, but using flowers, but I won't talk about it. Morphological novelties often arise as modifications of existing structures. So sometimes a trait that is adaptive in one context is also advantageous under different circumstances. So this is called exaptation. So exaptation is when a trait that's adaptive in one context is advantageous in another. And so an example of that is, sorry to keep coming back to this, but feathered dinosaurs. So again, it's thought that the first feathered dinosaurs had the feathers not for flight, but for display purposes. And later those feathers were handy dandy for flying around. So the use of feathers for flight instead of display is an example of exaptation. The feathers evolved initially because they were an adaptation for attracting mates or communicating visually. But then later, natural selection selected 4 feathers that would help these dinosaurs fly. So they were exapting if I can say that, exapting, they were undergoing exaptation. The feathers were used for a new purpose, and it's not the use that they originally evolved for, but they were making do with what they had. And then I'm skipping a bunch of sections in the book here if you're following along. And then another example of how developmental switches or developmental changes can account for pretty dramatic changes in speciation is genetic switches being flicked on and off. All right, and so what I mean by that is there are genes that control the development of an organism. And sometimes these genes, instead of like a mutation forming and creating new information, sometimes just the pattern of flipping genes on and off can affect the resulting phenotype of the organism. So let's just go to the example. So these are stickleback fish, and the ones up here on the top, this is a picture of the skeleton of a stickleback fish that lives in a marine or saltwater environment. This is a picture of a stickleback fish that lives in a freshwater environment. And it's pretty subtle, but if you notice that, you'll notice that the marine stickleback has these big spines, and the freshwater stickleback has these small spines. And this is advantageous in each environment. So when you're in the ocean, these spines help protect you against getting eaten by a larger fish. Right? So they try to bite you and your spines stab them in the mouth and maybe you can get away, or you're more difficult to eat. In a freshwater environment, your main predator in this case isn't getting eaten by another fish, but rather getting eaten by dragonfly larvae. So dragonfly larvae they hide somewhere in the vegetation or the sediment at the bottom of the pond or the lake or the river. And when you swim by, they reach out with their jaw and grab you. And so having these spines means that there's just more surface area for these dragonfly larvae to grab. So if you have these big spines, these dragonfly larvae could grab you and pull you in and eat you. So natural selection selected for stickleback fish with smaller spines. Well, how do their spines go from large to small? And the answer is just a gene got turned off. So there's a gene that controls the development of these spines, and you can see that it's being expressed in the larvae of the marine stickleback, but it doesn't get expressed in these. So basically, losing their spines simply meant turning that gene off. So you could get a pretty rapid phenotypic change just due to flicking off one of the genetic switches. And there's lots of other examples of that, but for the sake of time, I won't get into that now. Okay, so that wraps up part B.